A little girl, while celebrating her cousin's birthday, is abducted. She is later found brutally murdered. The perpetrator is convicted and sentenced to life, but did they get the right man? This is the case of Sophie Hook. Sophie Hook was born in 1988. She lived in Cheshire in the UK. In 1995, aged 7 years old, Sophie visits family in Wales to celebrate her cousin's birthday. She stays at her uncle Danny Jones' house. Sophie and her cousins spent that summer afternoon playing in the garden in an inflatable pool. Unbeknown to them, they were being watched. At the back of this garden ran a bridle path, and from there a man named Howard Hughes was crouched down, hiding in the bushes, watching these children play. From this location, not only would Howard be able to watch these children, he would also be able to overhear their conversations, including their plans to camp outdoors that evening. That evening, 3 out of the 4 children, so Luke, his sister and Sophie, decided to sleep in tents in the garden. At 12:40 a.m, the uncle, Danny, checks in on them and then retires to bed himself. At 2:30 a.m, the little boy Luke is woken up by something, and he looks across and he sees Sophie sleeping next to him, and then alongside her, his sister. So at that point, Sophie is still there. At 2:55 a.m, Howard Hughes is questioned by a patrolling police officer. He sat at the end of Sophie's uncle's road, and he's just sat there with his bike, smoking and drinking. At around 7 a.m, Luke and his sister wake up and realise Sophie is gone. She's nowhere to be seen. Perhaps she went back indoors. After nearly an hour of searching the house and the garden, wondering where she might have gone, the family call the police and report Sophie Hook as missing. Just before the children had woken up, Sophie had been found by a dog walker. Her body had been washed up onto a beach around half a mile away, and she had been brutally murdered. Her right arm and ankle were broken, and she had bruises consistent of being dragged by the hand. She had been violently beaten and SA'd, and all of these injuries occurred whilst she was still alive. The doctor carrying out the autopsy said that during the attack, Sophie had been in so much pain that she left teeth marks on both sides of her tongue and inside her lower lip. Her death was caused by manual strangulation, which lasted up to 3 minutes. Afterwards, the perpetrator had thrown her body into the sea like trash, in the hopes of washing any forensic evidence away. Howard Hughes, born in 1965, was the local kind of odd man in the village, and he was arrested the same day that Sophie's body was discovered for that murder. He lived with his mother and was a known child sex offender. During the years prior to Sophie's murder, he had been accused of assaulting up to 5 girls, aged between 5 and 9. In 1981, so 15 years prior, when Howard Hughes was 16 years old, he took a 7-year-old boy into a derelict house, where he exposed himself and made indecent suggestions, before attempting to strangle his victim. The boy pretended to be dead until Howard left. Howard was convicted of assaulting that boy and placed under a 2-year mental health supervision order and committed to a psychiatric unit. Howard is very quickly arrested for the murder of Sophie Hook within hours of discovering her body. He is later released due to lack of evidence. After searching his home, they do discover indecent images of children and rearrest him. Whilst in custody for the possession of indecent images, Howard's brother-in-law, sister and father come to visit him. Hours after his family members left, Howard is rearrested for the SA, abduction and murder of Sophie Hook, based on new information that his father had given police. According to his father, Howard had confessed to the murder. Howard also gave the location of Sophie's clothes. He said that he was wandering the streets and saw something in a derelict house. He picked it up, intending to use it as toilet paper, but disregarded it and threw it away. He thought that might be of interest to police. Howard at this point is saying that that is the only information he gave his father. He never confessed to murdering Sophie. Regardless of the fact that Howard is denying that confession, they have a father willing to testify against his son, and Howard has pinpointed them to the location of Sophie Hook's dress. So Howard is arrested and held in custody until trial the following year. 1 year later at trial, they have no forensic evidence linking Howard Hughes to the case of Sophie Hook. They do, however, have 3 main witnesses, one being Howard Hughes' father, who is testifying that his son confessed to him that he killed Sophie Hook. The second witness they have is 30-year-old Jonathan Carroll, who is a criminal himself. On the night that Sophie was murdered, Jonathan was out stealing from people's gardens. He said that he saw Howard walking down the road with a sack, and when he glimpsed in it, he was sure that he saw a naked body. The third witness is a convicted child sex offender who testified that Howard Hughes boasted to him a few years prior to Sophie's murder that he would really like to essay a girl aged around 4 or 5. The jury returned a guilty verdict on all 3 counts of essay, abduction and murder, and Howard, aged 31, gets 3 life sentences. However, did they get the right man? Howard Hughes' case is actually supported by the Innocence Project, and these are the reasons why. So there was a lot of circumstantial evidence in this case, and one of them is that a policeman saw him wandering around the evening that Sophie was taken. Now, Howard Hughes often wandered around at night. He would go night fishing, he would just kind of wander the streets. He was born with a birth defect, which meant he had learning difficulties and behavioural problems. He also grew at a very rapid rate and was actually around 6'8". This is going to be important later. He was odd, which in turn made him a target for police. They arrested him very quickly after the discovery of Sophie's body. So did the police really kind of investigate other avenues, or did they just target Howard Hughes? The fact that Howard knew the location of Sophie's dress was crucial evidence for the prosecution. However, it can be flipped. Why would Howard give away this information, basically incriminating himself, if he did it? The way he phrased it to his father was, "I think I found something important last night, and this is where I found it. I think the police need to know." If he did murder Sophie Hook, why would he divulge this information? Howard Hughes always wore DEET spray, which is like a really strong insect repellent. Now that spray was found on the dress, which Howard openly admitted to picking up. He was going to use it as toilet paper, but then he threw it away. However, no DEET spray was found on the tent, on Sophie's sleeping bag, which it should have been if he was the one to abduct Sophie. The prosecution's star witness is Howard's father, Gerald. Now, Gerald and Howard have a very bitter relationship. Howard was not the son that Gerald wanted. Gerald was very spiteful towards his son and often just wanted him gone, which makes the credibility of him as a witness questionable. When Gerald left the room after he'd just spoken to his son, who was in custody, he immediately told police the information regarding the dress. It wasn't until a few hours later that he called the police and then told them that actually Howard had confessed to the murder. As a father who always wanted his son gone out of his life, had he thought up a plan to try and make that happen? If we also look at the logistics, so Sophie was sleeping in between Luke and his sister. So for someone to come into the tent and abduct Sophie without making a sound, without waking either of the other children, is quite a feat, especially if you think it was meant to be Howard, who was 6'8". At 6'8", he is meant to be crouching, undoing the tent, climbing into this small child's tent and dragging Sophie away without waking any of the other children. He's also done all of that without leaving any forensic evidence. The only evidence left was a footprint on the tent door, and this was ruled out. It wasn't Howard's, and it also wasn't the uncle's. It was never identified. So did Sophie leave the tent on her own accord? Maybe she needed the toilet and Howard was there ready to grab her and abduct her. Now, this would explain why there was no DEET spray on the tent or the sleeping bag and no forensics. However, when Gerald, Howard's father, made this confession and said, Howard has told me, he said in that confession that Howard went into the tent to get Sophie. So things aren't really adding up. The only other way that Sophie left that tent is if she left compliantly. So if she knew the perpetrator. So logistically, what actually happened remains a mystery. If we go back to the forensic evidence, so Sophie Hook was horrifically essayed both vaginally and anally. The forensic team at the time said that with such a violent crime, you would expect marks on the perpetrator. Howard Hughes voluntarily was examined by a doctor and gave forensic samples, and there was absolutely no evidence that he had been sexually active at all, let alone violently sexually active with Sophie Hook. When Howard was arrested, he was wearing the same clothes as he was the day before. However, there was no forensics found on those either. Sophie not only had been violently essayed, she had been violently beaten. There were no blood, fibres, anything on Howard Hughes. There were also scratch marks all over Sophie Hook, and so the perpetrator would have had that DNA under their fingernails. The problem with that is Howard Hughes bit down his fingernails so much, and medically that was actually on record that he had done that since he was 13. He had no fingernails to scratch with, so it would have been impossible for him to have made those marks. Howard also was not the only man out at night acting unusual. At a local psychiatric unit, an ex-soldier had escaped that evening. The psychiatric unit is based very close to where the children were sleeping in the garden. He returned in the morning soaked, as though he'd been swimming in the sea. Shortly after this, he took his own life. Now, we cannot say obviously that he was the perpetrator, that would be highly disrespectful, but what it does show was that there were other people acting oddly that night that the police may not have investigated because they were so honed in and targeted on Howard Hughes that they didn't look elsewhere to see what was going on. That was the case of Sophie Hook. If you like my content, please remember to like, subscribe and comment, and I will see you in the next one.